Hello and welcome to the Kyiv Post Podcast with me, Rahemtulla. In today's programme, we'll discuss the highlights from the April 21st edition of the newspaper. We'll be looking at the Eurovision Song Contest, which comes to Ukraine in just about 3 weeks' time, and we'll delve into fraud in the banking sector. But first, we turn to our cover story on former riot police officers who have fled Ukraine for Russia. Olena Goncharova was covering the story, and she joins me now. Olena, why did these former riot police flee? And why has this provoked such a strong reaction from society?
Well, I think the reason for such a strong reaction is that it's not the first time when former riot police officers flee Ukraine. First, there was a case 2 years ago when one of the commanders fled Ukraine, and now, after the appeals court released one of those former officers, it was possible for him to flee because the court said there are no risks of him to being released. And so it became possible for him as well as for his other 3 colleagues to flee, and they apparently went to Russia because later they released a video from Russia in which they pleaded not guilty and said that the prosecutors in Ukraine are biased towards them.
So what are the charges that they were facing?
So they were charged with murder, torturing and assaulting protesters back in 2014, and then 2 of those former officers were also charged with beating up human rights activists at one of the checkpoints in eastern Ukraine in 2015.
So, and the 4 men who are the subject of your article who have fled to Russia, they're not the only ones who have been charged or been under suspicion of such crimes, but have we seen anyone else spend time in jail, or have we seen any other sentences passed?
So there are at least 20 former Berkut police officers charged with different crimes, and most of them luckily remain in Ukraine still, with some released and others in custody or awaiting trial. And there are still 5 members of the same unit, the Kharkiv unit, that are currently on trial on suspicion of murdering protesters in the end of the revolution.
So quite a few people in detention there, but as you and your co-author Oleg Sukhov write, the lack of prosecutions highlights a bigger problem in Ukraine with the judicial system. Tell us a little bit about what those are.
The biggest problem in Ukraine is that courts are not transparent, and often the judges are loyal to the interior minister, to prosecutors, and to all those people in power who could influence them. And basically, in my opinion, I think in some cases it was better for the judges to release some of those former police officers so they would not testify against other people who were higher in this hierarchy of interior ministry that was under President Viktor Yanukovych.
Well, Elena, it sounds like the search for justice continues. That's where we'll have to leave it, but thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
That was Olena Goncharova, staff writer here at the Kyiv Post. We turn now to fraud in the banking sector, of which Ukraine has had more than its fair share. The latest revelations also bring Austria's Maidan Bank into the picture. Staff writer Josh Kavensky was covering the story, and he joins me now. Josh, how is it that an Austrian bank has a role to play in Ukrainian banking fraud?
In this case, it goes back to the history of the bank itself. Maidan Bank belongs to a man named Julius Maidan. He belongs to an aristocratic Austrian family that first got wealthy in the 1860s through owning luxury grocery stores. It actually extended throughout the Austrian Hungarian Empire into Ukraine. After the fall of communism and the reopening of Ukraine and the former territories of the Austrian Hungarian Empire, Maidan saw an opportunity to expand into his family's former turf. Though what's interesting about him is that he decided to move the family company away from groceries and into finance. So he started making a lot of investments into Ukraine and began to build relationships in the 1990s with the owners of many people who in Ukraine became bankers. There's something that's worth understanding about the Ukrainian banking system. It doesn't necessarily work in the same way as we in the West would think of banks. Oftentimes the way they're used is basically as a vacuum cleaner, is what they call it here, where they collect as many deposits as they can. They give people annual rates of return as high as 30 or 40%, and then just steal as much money as they can in order to fund their businesses, the profits of which are used to maintain the banking scheme and then take more money. So what Maidan Bank ended up doing, it ended up acting as a way to launder the money that they're stealing from these depositors out of Ukraine and back into the pockets of the bank owners.
And so you mentioned in the article that Ukraine's national bank are implicated here. So what was their role, and is there a case that they should have to answer to?
Right. So that the National Bank of Ukraine's role in this has to do with a peculiarity of the scheme. Basically, so as I said, it allowed them to launder money out of the country. It basically allowed the owners of these banks to accomplish three things. It allowed them to accomplish the embezzlement of the funds in the first place. It allowed them to launder the money, and it also allowed them to artificially inflate the capital of the banks they own in Ukraine. How did it do that? So the way the scheme worked was the Ukrainian bank would open a correspondent account with the Austrian Maidan Bank. Then was sign a loan agreement with Maidan Bank using the correspondent account as collateral. The National Bank would have seen all of this, not only because they have access to information about banks' loans, but also because under Ukrainian law, for a bank to register a correspondent account with a foreign bank, they need to get certification from the NBU to do that, from the National Bank of Ukraine. The next step in the scheme after signing that loan agreement would be that Maidan Bank would then make a separate loan to a shell company whose owners were connected to the owner of the Ukrainian bank in the first place, and the collateral for that loan would be the money in the correspondent account by the Ukrainian bank. So that way, Maidan would maybe get like a 5 or 10% cut of the total, theoretically, but 90% would go back to the owners of the original bank. By that way, the money would disappear from the Ukrainian bank, leave the country, so it's laundered because now it's just a loan to this shell company and not stolen money from depositors, and kind of make a full circle to the owners of the bank. The trick of it, though, is that the Ukrainian banks would not register the loan agreement internally. They wouldn't put it on their books, but they would register the fact that they had a correspondent account. So even the money had disappeared on their books, you wouldn't see the liability. You would only see the asset of the correspondent account, which made it seem like they had more money than they actually had. And then, so what ended up happening was in 2014, 15, 16, when all these banks began to collapse, because they saw that the banks were collapsing and theoretically wouldn't be able to service this loan, they then seized the money in the correspondent account, making a huge windfall. So that's their role in the fraud.
And so what's the Austrian response been to all of this? Have they made any headway into the investigation?
It's been slow. So basically, the National Bank head, Valeria Gontarova, the new one who came in after Maidan, in September 2014, she informed the head of the Austrian Central Bank of the existence of this scheme. It did not prevent Maidan Bank from seizing the correspondent accounts that were already in the bank throughout 2015. It's not clear if any more loans were conducted during that time, but at that time, at least, the Austrians, September 2014 is when we know the Austrians first explicitly knew about it. In terms of what their investigation is doing, we know that they opened a money laundering investigation into Maidan Bank in February 2017. We know that from press reports from Vienna. But if you think about the time frame there, that's essentially December 2014 to February 2017 is 2.5 years until they actually opened the investigation. And 1 year, I should note, after this scheme was exposed publicly by anti-corruption activists in Ukraine, who exposed it in February 2016. So that's quite a time lapse. The head of the National Anti-Corruption Bureau in Ukraine was on the record a couple weeks ago saying that Austrian investigators were the least helpful. But at the same time, the NABU has also kind of tried to walk that back a little bit. By all appearances, it seems that they are dragging their feet a little bit.
Well, Josh, it sounds like the search for those missing funds is going to continue for a little while to come. But that's where we'll have to leave it for today. Thank you for joining us.
It was a pleasure.
That was Josh Kavensky on fraud in the banking sector. But we turn our attention now to something a little bit different in the form of the Eurovision Song Contest, which is coming to Kyiv in a little over 3 weeks. Preparations are well underway, and staff writer here Anna Yakutenko joins me now to tell us a little bit more about how those are going. Anna, is Kyiv ready for the big show?
So Kyiv basically is ready for the big show. The stage is 95% complete and all the constructions are going well. Organizers expect everything to be ready by April 30th, when the first 9 countries who participate in semi-final will start their rehearsals.
So it all sounds like it's going pretty well, but as we know, this wouldn't be Ukraine if there weren't at least a few scandals. have we had any of those?
So there was some kind of scandal in February when part of the team of the organizers quit, accusing of non-transparency the head of public broadcaster, and they resigned in protest. Also, the public broadcaster admitted that there were some delays, and there were also a scandal with the official ticket company, because they launched the tender for the ticket company, and then anti-monopoly committee said that tender was non-transparent, but they still signed the contract with the same company, and things are going ahead.
Well, and the biggest scandal of all, perhaps we've already seen, came in the form of Russia, because they withdrew from the competition when Ukraine banned their contestant from being allowed to enter the country. And Eurovision isn't actually going to be officially broadcast in Russia now as a result. Has this been a big blow to the contest?
EBU, the European public broadcaster, they officially encouraged Ukraine to allow Yulia Samoilova, who is a Russian singer, to let her in Ukraine. But according to Ukrainian law, she can't cross the border because she was performing in the annexed Crimea in 2015. So EBU said that was a bad decision for Ukraine. However, they still respect Ukrainian law. So they offered to Yulia Samoilova to participate in Eurovision via Skype. However, Russia refused to do so, and in the end, Russia withdrew from the contest and even wouldn't broadcast it. But I wouldn't say that it somehow affected other contestants. They still are coming to Ukraine, and the show seems to go on.
And so finally then, who should we be looking out for this year on stage? Who's going to be making a big splash, in your opinion?
So I would recommend to follow Italian singer, because bookmakers are making bets on him, and he seems to be pretty popular in his country. But you never know how the Eurovision end up.
Well, we'll all have to be keeping a close eye on the Italians. Anna, many thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
That was Anna Yakutenko on preparations for the Eurovision Song Contest. And on that note, that's where we'll have to leave it for today. Many thanks for listening. And remember, if you want to read more about any of the stories we've been discussing, you can do so at our website, kyivpost.com. Until next week, goodbye.